Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. Elian's hand trembled as he clutched the worn leather strap of his satchel. Inside, carefully packed among scrolls and magical trinkets, was the royal decree that had sealed his fate. He was the kingdom's chosen one, the young mage tasked with finding the answer that would save them all, but now, standing on the edge of the enchanted forest, the very forest that had swallowed countless adventurers whole, Elian felt far less than chosen. He felt small, scared, and utterly unprepared for what lay ahead. Behind him, the kingdom of Eldoria was crumbling under the weight of war and famine. The wizards had told him about the dark force sapping the magic from the land, withering crops, and draining the life from the kingdom's people. Elian had seen it for himself: the colorless sky, the fields of shriveled wheat, the hollow-eyed children who stared up at him as he left the capital. They had all looked at him as if he were their savior, and it was that gaze that haunted him now as he stood before the looming trees. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder and exhaled. The trees stretched up so high they seemed to scratch the clouds, their branches gnarled and twisted in ways that defied natural laws. The forest itself had a pulse, an energy that hummed beneath the earth, vibrating under Elian's boots. "The sage lives in there," he muttered to himself, repeating the words of the Council of Wizards. "Find him, and he'll give you the answer. An answer that would save a kingdom." Elian had spent his life in the magical academy, learning spells, decoding ancient runes, and preparing for some distant conflict he thought would never come. Now, he was faced with a challenge that no amount of training could have fully prepared him for. Without looking back, he stepped into the forest. The air shifted the moment Elian crossed the threshold. The warmth of the afternoon sun disappeared, replaced by a cool, oppressive silence. His heart raced as he glanced around, his senses heightened. Every crunch of leaves beneath his boots seemed too loud, too intrusive. He half expected the trees themselves to wake and drag him into their gnarled embrace. He had been told stories as a child about the enchanted forest, about the creatures that lurked in its depths, the spirits that haunted its paths. But stories weren't enough to explain the reality of it. Elian could feel the magic here, ancient and untamed. It buzzed in the air, a constant reminder that he was not welcome. The path ahead was barely visible, overgrown with thorny vines and strange, luminescent mushrooms that seemed to glow with their own eerie light. He pressed forward, knowing that turning back wasn't an option. The kingdom was counting on him, and failure wasn't something he could afford. Not now. After what felt like hours of walking, Elian spotted movement up ahead. His heart leaped into his throat, and his hand instinctively went to the hilt of his dagger, though he knew it would do little against whatever magic was at play here. The figure that emerged from the shadows wasn't a creature or a spirit, but a man. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a cloak draped over his shoulders and a scar running down his left cheek. "Elian, right?" the man said, his voice rough but not unkind. Elian blinked, lowering his hand from his dagger. "Yes. How do you know who I am?" The man shrugged. "Word travels. My name's Kale. I've been sent to help you get through this forest." "Sent by who? Does it matter?" Kale asked with a smirk. "You'll need me if you want to survive out here." Elian eyed him warily, but something about Kale's presence was reassuring. He seemed comfortable in the forest, like he belonged here. Elian, on the other hand, felt out of place, like a rabbit wandering into a wolf's den. With a reluctant nod, Elian accepted Kale's company, and they began walking together, deeper into the heart of the forest. The hours passed in tense silence, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of some unknown creature. Kale led the way, moving with an ease that Elian envied. Every step he took was deliberate, confident, as if he knew exactly where they were headed. So, Kale said, breaking the silence, "You're after the sage?" Elian nodded. "The kingdom's in trouble. I need to find him and get the answers that'll save us." Kale chuckled, a deep, gravelly sound. "The sage doesn't just hand out answers, you know." "What do you mean?" "I mean, he's not a wishing well. People come here expecting him to solve their problems, but that's not how it works." Elian frowned, his grip tightening on his satchel. "Then how does it work?" "You'll see," Kale said cryptically, his eyes scanning the darkened path ahead. By the time they reached the first barrier, Elian was exhausted. His legs ached, and his mind was foggy from the strain of being constantly on edge. The path they had been following came to an abrupt end, blocked by a shimmering, translucent wall of magic. "This is it," Kale said, stopping in front of the barrier. Elian stared at it, his heart sinking. "What is this?" "It's a test," Kale said. "The first of many." Elian approached the barrier cautiously, his fingers brushing against the cool, humming surface. A flash of light erupted from the barrier, and suddenly, Elian was no longer in the forest. He was standing in the courtyard of the magical academy, surrounded by familiar faces. His instructors, his fellow students, and his brother. Elian's breath caught in his throat as he saw the familiar figure standing across from him, holding a staff identical to his own. His brother's eyes were hard, filled with anger and accusation. "You killed me," his brother said, his voice echoing in Elian's mind. "No," Elian whispered, backing away. "It was an accident." "I didn't mean, you were careless," his brother continued, stepping closer. "You thought you knew everything, but you didn't. You weren't ready." Elian shook his head, his heart racing. This couldn't be real. His brother was gone, had been gone for years. But the guilt still weighed on him. "Even now you don't deserve to save the kingdom," his brother said, his voice cold. "You couldn't even save me." Tears stung Elian's eyes as he dropped to his knees, his hands trembling. His brother's words cut deeper than any blade, reopening wounds that had never truly healed. But then, a voice echoed in his mind, a voice that wasn't his brother's. "True knowledge requires accepting your flaws." Elian's eyes snapped open, and he realized that this wasn't real. It was a test designed to break him, to make him doubt himself. With a deep breath, Elian forced himself to stand. He faced the figure of his brother, meeting his gaze with newfound determination. "I made a mistake," Elian said, his voice steady. "But that doesn't mean I'm unworthy. I've learned from my failures, and I'm ready to move forward." The figure of his brother stared at him for a moment longer, and then, without a word, he vanished. The barrier dissolved, and Elian found himself back in the forest, Kale watching him with an unreadable expression. "You passed," Kale said simply. Elian's legs were shaky as he continued walking, the weight of the test still heavy on his mind. But there was no time to dwell on it. There were more challenges ahead, and he needed to stay focused. As they moved deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to grow denser, their branches weaving together to form a thick canopy that blocked out the sun. The air grew colder, and the magic that pulsed through the forest seemed to grow stronger, more oppressive. It wasn't long before they encountered their next obstacle. Standing in their path was a massive, stone statue of a woman, her hands outstretched as if waiting for an offering. Her expression was serene, but there was an undeniable power in the way she loomed over them, her presence commanding respect. "This is the second test," Kale said, his voice low. "The test of sacrifice." Elian swallowed hard, his hand instinctively going to the pendant around his neck, a simple silver chain with a small, carved stone hanging from it. It had been his brother's, a gift from their mother, and it was the only thing Elian had left of him. you have to give up something precious to you, Kale explained. It's the only way to move forward. Elian stared at the statue, his heart pounding. He knew what he had to do, but that didn't make it any easier. The pendant was more than just a keepsake, it was a reminder of everything he had lost, everything he had fought for, but if he didn't do this, the kingdom would fall. With trembling fingers, Elian unclasped the pendant from around his neck and placed it in the statue's hands. The moment the pendant touched the stone, the statue's eyes glowed with a soft, golden light, and the ground beneath them rumbled, the path ahead cleared, and the statue's hands closed around the pendant, holding it tight. It's done, Kale said, his voice softer now. Let's keep moving. As the journey continued, Elian couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within him. The loss of the pendant had felt like losing his brother all over again, but there was a strange sense of peace that came with it, too. It was as if he had finally let go of the guilt that had been weighing him down for so long. By the time they reached the sage's dwelling, Elian felt like a different person. He had been stripped of everything, his fears, his doubts, even his most cherished possessions. All that remained was the purpose that had driven him from the beginning, to save the kingdom. The sage's home was nothing like Elian had imagined. It was a small, unassuming cottage nestled among the trees, with smoke curling lazily from the chimney. The air around it was still, almost serene, and for the first time since entering the forest, Elian felt a sense of calm wash over him. Kale stopped at the edge of the clearing, his eyes fixed on the cottage. "This is where I leave you," he said. "The rest of the journey is yours to make." Elian nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He hadn't realized how much he had come to rely on Kale's presence, but now, standing on the cusp of his final test, he knew that this was something he had to face alone. With a deep breath, Elian stepped forward and knocked on the cottage door. It swung open almost immediately, revealing a man who looked nothing like the ancient, wise figure Elian had imagined. The sage was young, barely older than Elian himself, with sharp features and a piercing gaze that seemed to see straight through him. "You've come a long way," the sage said, his voice calm but firm. "But you're not here for answers." Elian blinked, confused. "I'm not." "No," the sage replied, stepping aside to let Elian into the cottage. "You're here for understanding." Elian stepped into the small cottage, feeling the weight of the sage's words sink in. The inside was simple, plain wooden furniture, a few shelves lined with dusty books, and a small fire crackling in the hearth. It wasn't at all what Elian had imagined for a man with such power and knowledge. Everything about the place was unassuming, ordinary even, and yet the atmosphere felt thick with something more, something ancient. The sage gestured to a chair. "Sit." Elian sat, feeling the heat of the fire wash over him as the sage lowered himself into a seat across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out between them like a tangible thing. Elian wasn't sure if he should say something, ask questions, demand answers, or if this was yet another part of the test. Finally, the sage broke the silence. "You came all this way seeking a solution to save your kingdom. But along the way, you've already learned what you need to know, haven't you?" Elian's throat tightened. "I don't know what you mean." "The kingdom is falling apart. There's a darkness spreading, and you believe I have the answer to make it all go away," the sage interrupted, his voice steady, but with an edge that made Elian falter. "That's what you were told. That I hold the knowledge to save everything." Elian nodded, unsure where this was going. "The council said you could." "The council," the sage said with a faint smile. "They believe knowledge is the solution to all things. But knowledge without wisdom is a dangerous tool. Tell me, what did you sacrifice on your way here?" The question struck Elian like a physical blow. He thought of the pendant he had placed in the hands of the stone statue, the only thing he had left of his brother. His fingers twitched, reaching instinctively for the chain that was no longer there. "Gave up the last thing I had of my brother," Elian said quietly. The sage nodded, his gaze never leaving Elian's face. "And why did you do it?" Elian swallowed hard. "Because I had to. It was the only way forward." "No," the sage said, his voice firm. "It wasn't the only way. It was the way you chose. The statue didn't demand your brother's pendant. It demanded something precious. You decided what was worth sacrificing. And that," the sage leaned forward, his eyes sharp, "is the lesson." Elian's breath caught in his throat. "I don't understand." The sage stood, walking to the small window that overlooked the forest. "You were willing to give up something that meant the world to you because you believed it would save your kingdom. That is a noble act, yes. But it was also an act of desperation. You thought that by making that sacrifice, you would find the answers you seek here. But the truth is, the answer doesn't lie with me." Elian frowned, confusion swirling in his chest. "Then why did I come all this way? Why go through the tests, the sacrifices, if not for the answer?" The sage turned to face him, his expression softened by something like understanding. "Because this journey wasn't about finding an answer to save your kingdom. It was about understanding the cost of saving it. Knowledge alone won't save your people. It's your willingness to act, to sacrifice, and to carry the burden of that knowledge that will make the difference." Elian sat in stunned silence, his mind racing to grasp the meaning of the sage's words. He had been so focused on the idea of a magical solution, of some grand answer that would fix everything, that he hadn't considered the weight of the responsibility that came with it. The sage crossed the room and sat back down, his eyes locking onto Elian's. "You're not here for a simple spell or incantation. You're here because you need to understand what it truly means to lead, to bear the knowledge of what must be done, and to accept the cost that comes with it. The darkness spreading through your kingdom is not something you can simply banish with magic. It's the result of choices made, of consequences coming to fruition. You can't undo that with a wave of your hand. You must guide your people through it, shoulder the weight of their pain, and lead them toward rebuilding." Elian's heart thudded painfully in his chest. "But, if there's no magic to stop it, then what can I do? I'm just a mage. I'm not a leader." "You weren't before," the sage said softly. "But you are now." The words hit Elian like a tidal wave, overwhelming in their simplicity. He had spent so long thinking of himself as a tool for the kingdom, a weapon to be wielded by others, that he hadn't considered the possibility that he could be something more. That the responsibility of leadership could fall to him, not because of his magic, but because of the choices he was willing to make. "Then, what am I supposed to do?" Elian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The sage smiled faintly. "That is for you to decide. You've been given the tools, the knowledge and the understanding of what must be done. The rest is up to you. You can choose to return to your kingdom and face the challenges ahead, or you can turn away from that responsibility. But know this, whatever choice you make, there will be consequences. For better or for worse." Elian sat there for a long moment, his mind swirling with the weight of everything he had heard. He had come all this way seeking a solution, a way to fix the kingdom's problems. But the sage was right, there was no simple answer. The journey had been about more than just finding a solution. It had been about understanding what it meant to carry that knowledge, to bear the responsibility that came with it, and Elian knew, deep down, that he couldn't walk away. Not now that he stood, his legs feeling shaky beneath him, and met the sage's gaze. "I'll do it. I'll return to the kingdom and do what needs to be done." The sage's expression softened, and for the first time, Elian saw something like approval in his eyes. "Good. Then go, Elian. Your people are waiting for you." Without another word, the sage turned back to the window, leaving Elian standing there in the small, quiet room. He knew that the journey ahead would be harder than anything he had faced so far, but for the first time, he felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose as he walked to the door, his hand resting on the worn wood for a moment before he stepped outside. The air was cool and crisp, the forest quiet around him. As he began the journey back through the trees, he felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of his fears had been lifted. He had no illusions about what lay ahead. There would be sacrifices, and the darkness threatening his kingdom wouldn't disappear overnight. But he knew now that he could face it, that he had the strength to lead his people through it, and that, more than any spell or magical incantation, was what would save them. Elian walked forward, his steps steady and sure as he left the enchanted forest behind. The kingdom awaited him, and with it, the challenges that would test everything he had learned. But he was ready now, ready to accept the responsibility that came with the knowledge he had gained, and in the distance, beyond the trees, the faint light of the kingdom's future began to shine.